In the late summer of 1940, in the quiet countryside of southwestern France, a discovery was made that no one was looking for. There was no planned expedition, no scientific mission, and no sense that history was about to shift. It began with 4 teenage boys, Marcel Ravida, Jacques Marsal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Cuencas, and a dog named Robot. While walking near the village of Montignac, Robot disappeared into a hole left behind by a fallen tree. When the boys followed, squeezing through the opening with a lamp and a sense of curiosity, they entered a space that had not been seen by human eyes for thousands of years. What they found was the Lascaux Cave. At first, they could not fully understand what surrounded them. The cave walls rose and curved in the dim light, and almost immediately shapes began to emerge. Large animals seemed to move across the stone, bulls, horses, deer, painted in rich reds, blacks, and browns. The boys realized they were not alone in this place. Someone had been there long before them. Someone had left a record. When archaeologists arrived soon after, they understood the importance almost instantly. The paintings were unlike anything previously documented in such scale and detail. More than 600 painted figures and nearly 1,500 engravings filled the cave's chambers. The animals were not crude sketches, they were precise. Muscles were defined, proportions were accurate. Movement was suggested through posture and layering. These were the works of skilled hands. Over time, researchers determined that the paintings were created during the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly between 15,000 and 17,000 years ago. This was confirmed through radiocarbon dating of charcoal pigments and by comparing the art style to other known sites in Europe. The artists used mineral-based pigments like ochre and manganese, sometimes mixing them with animal fat or water. Brushes were likely made from hair or plant fibers, and in some cases pigment was blown through hollow bones to create soft edges and shading. What became clear early on was that this art was intentional. The paintings were not random decoration. Animals were carefully chosen and placed in specific areas of the cave. Some overlapped older images, suggesting the cave was used repeatedly across generations. Certain chambers were filled with movement and energy, while others were quiet and sparse. This was not the work of someone passing time. It was planned. It meant something. For decades, the dominant explanation was that cave art like this served ritual purposes. Many scholars believed the paintings were connected to hunting magic, meant to ensure successful hunts or honor animal spirits. Others suggested shamanistic practices, with the cave acting as a spiritual space where altered states of consciousness played a role. These interpretations were based on comparisons with later indigenous traditions and ethnographic studies. Much of Lascaux fit these ideas. The animals painted were mostly large game species important for survival. The cave itself was deep and dark, far from daily living spaces, which suggested it had special meaning. But even early researchers noticed that not everything fit so neatly. One section of the cave stood apart from the rest. Known as the Shaft of the Dead Man, or simply the Shaft Scene, this area was harder to reach and unlike any other chamber in Lascaux. Instead of graceful animals moving across stone, the imagery here was strange and unsettling. A large bison appeared wounded, its body pierced. Nearby was a bird-headed human figure, rigid and simplified, lying or falling. A bird stood atop a pole beside him. Above the bison were a series of small dots arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate. This scene troubled researchers from the beginning. Human figures are extremely rare in Paleolithic cave art, and when they appear, they are usually abstract. The bird-headed figure did not resemble the animals elsewhere in the cave. It was symbolic in a way the others were not. The dots above the bison did not resemble weapons or wounds. They were separate, floating, and carefully placed. Early interpretations struggled. Some thought the scene represented a myth or a story passed down orally. Others suggested it depicted a hunting accident or a vision experienced during a ritual. There was no agreement. What everyone did agree on was that this scene was different. As more detailed studies were conducted, additional questions emerged. Researchers mapped the cave and noticed that certain animals appeared more often than others. Bulls and horses dominated, while animals known to be hunted frequently, like reindeer, were less common. This raised doubts about purely hunting-based explanations. Why celebrate animals that were not central to daily survival? The dots, too, raised questions. Similar dot clusters appeared in other parts of the cave, sometimes near specific animals, sometimes standing alone. They were not random marks. Their repetition suggested a shared system of meaning, one that was consistent enough to be understood by the people who created them. At the same time, scholars remained cautious. Without written records, interpretation is always uncertain. The danger of projecting modern ideas onto ancient art is real. Patterns can be found even when none were intended. Archaeology relies on evidence that can be tested and compared, and symbolism is difficult to prove. Still, Lascaux resisted simple explanations. As years passed, the cave became famous, drawing visitors from around the world. Eventually, human breath and humidity began to damage the paintings, forcing authorities to close the original cave and create a replica nearby. While this protected the art, it also turned Lascaux into something more distant, almost untouchable. Yet research continued through photographs, scans, and careful documentation. Among a small group of researchers, a different question began to take shape. It did not reject ritual or symbolism, but it added another possibility. What if some of the images were not just about life on the ground, but about the sky above? This idea did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly as scholars noticed relationships between animal figures and the placement of dots. Some animals seemed to align with seasonal cycles. Others appeared in groupings that felt structured rather than expressive. The shaft scene, with its unusual symbols and isolated location, became central to this discussion. The question was never framed as a bold claim. No serious researcher argued that Lascaux was a star chart in the modern sense. Instead, the suggestion was quieter and more careful. Could Ice Age humans have recorded observations of the night sky using symbols meaningful to them? Could animals stand in for patterns they saw repeatedly above them? Could the dots represent something counted or tracked over time? At this stage, there were no answers, only curiosity. Lascaux, like many ancient discoveries, whether found on land or beneath the sea in underwater archaeology, reminds us how much of human history is still incomplete. Unlike lost underwater cities or submerged civilizations explored by divers, this mystery lies hidden in stone and darkness, preserved by chance rather than water. Yet the challenge is the same. We are trying to understand minds separated from us by thousands of years, using traces they never intended as explanations. As the chapter closes, the mystery remains open. The cave was found by accident, but the questions it raised were not accidental at all. Whether the images reflect ritual, myth, memory, or something more structured, they point to a depth of thought that refuses to be reduced to simple survival. And so the story begins here, not with answers, but with a quiet and persistent question, one that continues to draw researchers back into the shadows of the cave, asking what else these ancient walls might be trying to tell us. Around 14,500 years ago, the world looked very different from today. Much of Europe was still feeling the long shadow of the last ice age. Glaciers covered large parts of the north, and even in places like what is now southern France, the climate was colder, drier, and far less predictable. Forests came and went with shifting temperatures. Herds of animals migrated across open plains, following grass that appeared only at certain times of the year. For the people living then, survival depended on understanding patterns, when animals moved, when plants returned, when winters loosened their grip. These were not casual observations. Ice Age hunter-gatherers lived close to the edge. A missed season could mean starvation. A poorly timed journey could be fatal. Over generations, people learned to read their surroundings with great care. They watched the behavior of animals, the direction of winds, the length of shadows, and the slow changes in temperature. And above all, they watched the sky. Anthropologists largely agree on this point. Long before writing, long before cities or monuments, humans used the natural world as a guide for time. The rising and setting of the sun marked the day. The phases of the moon shaped shorter cycles. The return of certain stars signaled changes that could be trusted when the land itself was uncertain. These patterns were consistent in a way weather was not. There is no written record from the Paleolithic period telling us exactly how people understood the sky. That absence creates caution. But archaeology offers quiet hints. One of the clearest comes from objects often called tally bones, found across Europe and dated to tens of thousands of years ago. These bones, sometimes made from reindeer or mammoth, carry repeated markings, lines, notches, and groupings that suggest counting or tracking over time. Some researchers, including Alexander Marshak in the 20th century, argued that these markings could reflect lunar cycles. Others disagreed, saying the evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. What matters here is not whether those interpretations are correct, but that they exist at all. They reflect a growing recognition that Ice Age humans were capable of abstract thought and long-term observation. They did not simply react to nature, they studied it. Much later, prehistoric structures, built thousands of years after Lascaux, show clear alignments with the sun and seasons. Sites like Stonehenge are often mentioned in this context, though they belong to a different era and should not be directly compared. Still, they demonstrate that watching the sky and connecting it to life on Earth became an important human practice very early on. Oral traditions preserved in historic and indigenous cultures around the world also point in this direction. Stories passed down for generations often link animals, stars, and seasons together. While these traditions cannot be traced directly back to the Paleolithic, they show how natural patterns were woven into meaning without written language. Against this backdrop, researchers returned to Lascaux with new questions. The cave's animal imagery had always been impressive, but closer study revealed something else. Certain animals appeared far more often than others. Bulls, horses, and aurochs dominated the walls. Birds, though less common, appeared in striking and symbolic ways. Meanwhile, animals that were clearly hunted for food, such as reindeer, were underrepresented. This imbalance raised eyebrows. If the paintings were only about hunting, why focus so heavily on animals that were not the primary food source? Why repeat certain figures again and again across different chambers? Researchers also noticed that the animals were not scattered randomly. They were grouped. Some appeared alone, others formed clusters. In certain areas, the same combinations appeared repeatedly, suggesting a shared system of meaning understood by the people who created them. This is where the idea of symbolic representation entered the conversation. Some scholars proposed that the animals could stand for more than themselves. They might represent seasons, cycles, or moments in the year that mattered deeply to survival. A large bull might signal a time of abundance. A horse could mark migration or transition. These interpretations remained cautious and grounded in ethnographic parallels rather than bold claims. A smaller group of researchers took the idea one step further. They asked whether these symbolic animals could also relate to the sky, not in the modern sense of constellations with fixed names, but as patterns noticed through repeated observation. After all, recognizing that certain stars rise at the same time every year does not require telescopes or mathematics. It requires patience and memory. This suggestion met immediate resistance. Many archaeologists warned against projecting modern astronomical thinking onto ancient art. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature, and it is easy to see meaning where none was intended. Without written explanation, interpretation risks becoming speculation. Others responded that complete rejection carries its own bias. Ice Age humans were intelligent, observant, and capable of symbolic thought. There is no reason to assume they ignored the sky, especially when it offered reliable signals in an unpredictable world. At Lascaux, the debate remained unresolved. Some animal groupings seemed to align with seasonal interpretations. Others did not. The evidence was uneven, and scholars disagreed on how much weight it could carry. Importantly, no serious researcher claimed certainty. This tension between caution and curiosity defines the mystery. Standing back, it becomes clear why the question matters. If Ice Age humans encoded sky knowledge into art, even in a loose symbolic way, it would reshape how we understand early human thought. It would suggest that people were not only reacting to their environment, but actively modeling it in their minds and passing that understanding on visually. And if they did not, if the art reflects ritual, myth, or storytelling unrelated to the sky, that conclusion is no less meaningful. It still shows a rich inner world shaped by observation and memory. In some ways, the challenge is similar to interpreting unexplained ruins or submerged civilizations studied through underwater archaeology. Whether examining sunken structures beneath the sea or painted chambers beneath the earth, researchers face the same problem. The builders are gone. The context is incomplete. Meaning must be reconstructed carefully, layer by layer, without forcing conclusions. Unlike deep-sea mystery sites or lost underwater cities, Lascaux has not been eroded by water or buried by sediment. It has been preserved by darkness and time. Yet the interpretive challenge remains just as complex as any ancient ocean discovery. As this chapter draws to a close, the audience is left at a crossroads. Ice Age humans were clearly capable observers of their world. They tracked animals, seasons, and environmental change with precision. They understood cycles because their lives depended on them. Whether those cycles extended into the night sky and whether that knowledge found its way onto cave walls remains uncertain. What is clear is that the question itself is reasonable, and once asked, it refuses to go away. The mystery does not deepen through dramatic claims, but through quiet persistence. Lascaux continues to invite careful attention, asking us not to decide too quickly what ancient people could or could not have known. To understand why the shaft scene became the center of so much debate, it helps to imagine how different it feels from the rest of Lascaux. Most chambers greet the eye with motion and life. Animals seem to run, turn, and overlap one another across curved stone walls. The scenes feel open, almost celebratory. But reaching the shaft is different. It lies deeper in the cave, harder to access, requiring a descent into a narrower space. From the beginning, this separation suggested that what lay inside mattered in a different way. The images here are few but striking. At the center is a large bison or aurochs, its body rigid, its head lowered. A long object pierces its side, giving the clear impression of a wound. Beneath it lies a human figure, drawn in a way unlike any other in the cave. The body is stiff, almost stick-like. The head is unmistakably bird-shaped, with a long beak. Nearby stands a bird perched on top of a vertical pole. Above the bison, a small cluster of dots floats in the empty stone. Nothing else in Lascaux looks quite like this. From the earliest studies, researchers noted how symbolic the scene appeared. It did not try to capture movement or realism in the way the animal halls did. The human figure lacked detail. The bird on a pole had no clear physical explanation, and the dots were neither wounds nor weapons. They were placed carefully, evenly spaced, and separate from the main figures. Documentation over decades confirmed that these dots were not random marks. They were applied deliberately, using the same pigments as the animals. Similar dot groupings appear elsewhere in the cave, often near specific animals, suggesting a shared visual language. This repetition mattered. In archaeology, repeated patterns signal intention. Early interpretations focused on myth and ritual. Some scholars believe the shaft scene represented a hunting story gone wrong, perhaps a cautionary tale passed down orally. Others suggested a shamanic vision, where the bird-headed figure symbolized a spiritual transformation. These ideas were grounded in ethnographic parallels and remained reasonable within the limits of available evidence. But none fully explained the dots. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a few researchers began asking different questions. Instead of asking what the scene meant symbolically, they asked whether it might also record something observed. The idea did not emerge suddenly or dramatically. It grew slowly as careful comparisons were made between the dot patterns and known star groupings. One of the most discussed proposals involved the Pleiades star cluster. This small group of bright stars has been noticed and named by cultures around the world for thousands of years. It is easy to see, appears consistently, and often plays a role in marking seasons. Researchers noted that the number of dots above the bison and their relative spacing bore a resemblance to how the Pleiades would have appeared in the Ice Age sky. To test this idea, archaeoastronomy researchers used astronomical software capable of reconstructing ancient skies. By accounting for Earth's slow axial movement, known as precession, they could model how constellations would have appeared 14,500 years ago from southern France. When these reconstructions were overlaid with the dot patterns, some alignments appeared surprisingly close. This did not prove intent, but it raised questions that could not be dismissed outright. Further comparisons suggested that the bison itself might correspond to a larger constellation pattern nearby. The bird imagery, rare in Paleolithic art, also became part of the discussion, as birds appear in star-related myths across many later cultures. Again, no one claimed direct continuity or shared meaning. The argument was more cautious. Ice Age humans could have associated animal forms with recurring star patterns as a way to remember seasonal changes. Supporters of this view emphasized simplicity. Recognizing that a cluster of stars returns at the same time each year does not require complex mathematics. It requires memory, storytelling, and repetition. For mobile hunter-gatherers, such knowledge could be useful without being written down. Mainstream archaeologists responded with measured skepticism. They pointed out that dot patterns are common in many forms of prehistoric art and can represent counts, tallies, or abstract symbols unrelated to the sky. Spears, wounds, or markers of importance could explain their placement just as well. The resemblance to star clusters, they argued, might be coincidental. They also stressed the danger of selective comparison. With enough flexibility, almost any pattern can be made to resemble something familiar. Without written confirmation, interpretation risks becoming subjective. Archaeology depends on evidence that can be tested and repeated, and symbolic readings often fall outside those boundaries. The disagreement was not hostile, but it was firm. Each side relied on different kinds of evidence. One focused on measurable alignment and environmental context. The other emphasized methodological caution and the limits of interpretation. Importantly, no serious researcher argued that the shaft scene was a detailed astronomical map in the modern sense. The hypothesis, at its strongest, suggested a loose symbolic connection between animals, dots, and observed sky patterns. It did not claim precision or scientific intent. What made the debate persistent was the scene's uniqueness. If the dots appeared randomly throughout the cave, the argument would fade quickly. But they did not. They appeared in specific places near specific figures and most prominently in the shaft scene itself. This is where the mystery deepened rather than resolved. Standing in that chamber, even through photographs and scans, one senses deliberation. The artists chose this location. They chose these figures. They chose to separate this scene from the rest. Whatever meaning it held was not meant to be casual or obvious. In this way, studying the shaft scene resembles other forms of careful investigation, not unlike how researchers approach unexplained ruins or sunken structures uncovered through underwater archaeology. Whether examining submerged civilizations or ancient caves, scholars must work with fragments, context, and restraint. The absence of certainty does not mean the absence of meaning. As the debate continued, the shaft scene became less about proving a theory and more about understanding early human thinking. Did these people encode information visually? Did they combine story, symbol, and observation into a single image? Or were later viewers imposing order onto something meant to be fluid and interpretive? The answers remain out of reach. What is clear is that the disagreement itself is grounded in real evidence and serious scholarship. No one dismisses the scene as meaningless. No one claims full understanding. Instead, the shaft scene stands as a focal point where observation meets imagination and where modern tools meet ancient intent. As this chapter closes, the audience is left in that narrow space, looking up at dots placed with care thousands of years ago. Whether they mirror stars or serve another purpose entirely, they continue to draw attention, inviting us to look closer without rushing to decide. The mystery is not whether Ice Age humans were capable of meaning. It is how much of that meaning we can still recognize today.
By the time the idea of an astronomical connection entered discussions about Lascaux, archaeologists were already used to disagreement. Debate is part of how the field works. What made this case different was not how bold the idea sounded, but how difficult it was to test. Archaeology depends heavily on evidence that can be checked by others. A stone tool can be measured, a pigment can be dated, a layer of soil can be compared across sites, but meaning is harder to pin down, especially when dealing with people who left no written records. Paleolithic art forces researchers to work with context, repetition, and comparison rather than direct explanation. This is where the astronomical map idea begins to strain under scrutiny. Many archaeologists accept without hesitation that Ice Age people observed the sky. That much is not controversial. The sun and moon are impossible to ignore, and their cycles are clear even without tools. The question is not whether early humans noticed stars, but whether they intentionally encoded star patterns into cave art. For critics, that step requires stronger proof than currently exists. One concern often raised is verification. If the dots in the shaft scene represent a specific star cluster, that interpretation should be repeatable and consistent across other sites from the same period. So far, similar dot and animal combinations have not been clearly identified elsewhere in a way that produces the same results. Without cross-site confirmation, the argument remains localized and fragile. Another concern comes from human psychology. Researchers point out that the human brain is exceptionally good at finding patterns. Psychologists call this tendency pareidolia, the ability to see familiar shapes or connections, even when they are accidental. Faces appear in clouds. Animals appear in rock formations. Constellations themselves are cultural creations, drawn by connecting stars that only loosely relate to one another. From this perspective, critics argue that modern viewers may be projecting meaning onto ancient symbols rather than uncovering meaning that was actually intended. A cluster of dots can resemble many things depending on what the viewer expects to see. There is also the problem of flexibility. If an interpretation allows for slight adjustments in position, number, or spacing to make a match work, it becomes difficult to falsify. Archaeology values explanations that can be challenged and potentially proven wrong. Symbolic readings often resist that process. Because of this, many scholars remain cautious. They do not dismiss the idea entirely, but they stop short of accepting it. To them, the astronomical interpretation is interesting but unproven. On the other side of the debate, supporters argue that extreme caution can also become a form of bias. If researchers assume in advance that Paleolithic people could not represent complex ideas visually, they may overlook evidence that does not fit simpler explanations. These scholars emphasize that Ice Age humans were not intellectually primitive. They made tools with precision. They navigated large territories. They passed knowledge across generations without writing. Symbolic thinking is already evident in personal ornaments, burial practices, and abstract markings found across Europe. From this viewpoint, representing recurring sky patterns using animals and dots does not seem unreasonable. It does not require advanced science, only careful observation and shared meaning within a group. Supporters also note that the shaft scene is not being interpreted in isolation. The argument draws on environmental context, repeated imagery, and the known importance of seasonal cycles. The astronomical hypothesis is presented as one possible layer of meaning, not a replacement for ritual or storytelling. Still, even among those open to the idea, restraint is common. Few argue for certainty. Most describe the hypothesis as suggestive rather than conclusive. Interestingly, similar debates appear in other areas of archaeology, though the details differ. Whether studying unexplained ruins on land or submerged structures examined through underwater archaeology, researchers face the same challenge. Material evidence survives, but intention does not. Just as with some ancient ocean discoveries or alleged sunken structures, interpretation must balance imagination with discipline. The key difference at Lascaux is that no one doubts the importance of the art itself. Across nearly all camps, there is agreement on several points. The paintings were intentional, they were created by skilled individuals, they held cultural significance, and they were likely meant to communicate something beyond simple decoration. Where disagreement begins is at the level of meaning. Some see myth and ritual as the primary purpose. Others see early systems of knowledge embedded within symbolic art. Both views are grounded in evidence, and both acknowledge uncertainty. What is notably absent from the scholarly debate is sensationalism. Despite how the topic is sometimes framed outside academic circles, professional discussions remain careful and measured. Researchers publish their findings in journals, present them at conferences, and invite critique. Claims are challenged, refined, or set aside based on evidence, not excitement. This process can feel slow, even frustrating, but it is deliberate. In many ways, the debate over the shaft scene reveals more about modern science than about ancient art. It shows how difficult it is to study minds separated from us by thousands of years. It also shows a willingness, at least among some researchers, to revisit old assumptions when new questions arise. As of now, no consensus exists. The astronomical map idea has neither been proven nor dismissed. It remains a possibility, discussed cautiously and often footnoted with disclaimers. That unresolved state is not a failure. It is the natural outcome of working with limited evidence and complex human behavior. Just as with lost underwater cities or submerged civilizations studied through careful dives and surveys, the absence of final answers does not mean the questions are wrong. It means the past is quieter than we would like it to be. As this chapter closes, what stands out is not division, but discipline. The debate continues because the evidence demands respect, and because Lascaux, like many of the world's most compelling ancient sites, refuses to be reduced to a single explanation. The mystery remains open, not because scholars lack answers, but because they understand the cost of choosing the wrong ones too quickly. Today, Lascaux is no longer a place people can freely walk into. By the early 1960s, it became clear that human presence was slowly damaging the paintings. Carbon dioxide from breath, changes in humidity, and microscopic organisms began to alter the cave walls. In 1963, the French Ministry of Culture made the difficult decision to close the original cave to the public. It was not an act of secrecy, but of preservation. Since then, Lascaux has entered a new phase of its existence. Exact replicas, beginning with Lascaux II and later expanded through Lascaux IV, were built just a short distance away. These reconstructions are based on detailed surveys, photographs, and laser scans. Every curve of the wall, Every pigment mark, every crack in the stone has been carefully recorded. For researchers, this means the cave is more visible now than it ever was in the past. High-resolution imaging allows scholars to examine details that early explorers could only guess at. Technology has helped in other ways as well. Improved radiocarbon dating has refined the timeline of the paintings. Chemical analysis of pigments has revealed how materials were sourced and mixed. Digital mapping has clarified how images relate to one another across different chambers. Yet for all this progress, one thing remains beyond reach. Symbolism cannot be scanned. No tool exists that can definitively explain what the artist meant. Technology can tell us how the paintings were made, when they were made, and even how often certain symbols appear. It cannot tell us why those symbols mattered. This is why the astronomical map question remains unresolved. There is no single piece of evidence that proves the dots in the shaft scene represent stars. There is also no evidence that conclusively rules it out. The alignments are suggestive, but not decisive. The patterns are intentional, but their meaning remains open. Every advance in documentation seems to sharpen the question rather than answer it. For some researchers, this uncertainty is frustrating. For others, it is precisely what makes Lascaux important. If the art does reflect observations of the sky, even loosely, the implications are profound. It would suggest that humans were thinking about time, cycles, and cosmic order far earlier than traditionally assumed. Not in written tables or measured charts, but through shared symbols passed down visually. It would place the roots of human astronomy deep in the Ice Age, long before agriculture or permanent settlements. But even if the astronomical interpretation is ultimately rejected, the mystery does not collapse. The alternative is not emptiness, it is depth. The shaft scene still represents a level of abstract thinking that challenges outdated ideas about early humans. The bird-headed figure, the deliberate isolation of the scene, and the careful placement of symbols all point to complex storytelling or belief systems. These were people capable of layering meaning, combining image and idea in ways we still struggle to interpret. In that sense, the debate is not about winning an argument. It is about expanding perspective. Archaeology has a long history of underestimating the mental worlds of prehistoric people. Time and again, new discoveries have forced revisions. Cave art itself was once dismissed as crude or decorative. Today, it is recognized as one of the earliest forms of human expression. Lascaux fits into a broader pattern seen across many fields of research. Whether studying unexplained ruins on land or investigating sunken structures through underwater archaeology, scholars often confront the same problem. Physical evidence survives, intent does not. Just as with lost underwater cities or submerged civilizations revealed by ancient ocean discoveries, interpretation must proceed carefully, guided by evidence but open to revision. The difference with Lascaux is that the site is not hidden beneath the sea or buried by sediment. It is hidden by time and meaning. Its mystery lies not in what we cannot see, but in what we cannot fully understand. That is why the cave still matters today. It matters because it reminds us that human intelligence did not appear suddenly with writing or cities. It developed slowly through observation, memory, and shared experience. It matters because it shows that early humans were not just surviving, but thinking about animals, about cycles, about their place in a world shaped by forces larger than themselves. For viewers today, standing before a replica of the cave or watching digital reconstructions, the experience can feel strangely intimate. The distance of thousands of years fades when faced with marks made by a human hand. The questions we ask about time, meaning, and connection are not so different from the ones that may have inspired those marks in the first place. The mystery endures because it is honest. It does not rely on sensational claims or dramatic revelations. It rests on careful study, ongoing debate, and the acceptance that some questions may remain open longer than we expect. In the end, Lascaux does not demand belief in a single explanation. It invites patience. The cave has given us images, patterns, and clues. It has allowed us to reconstruct its walls down to the smallest detail. What it has not given us is a final answer. And perhaps that is the point. The true value of the mystery lies not in proving whether an Ice Age astronomical map exists, but in recognizing how much of early human thought still lives just beyond our grasp. Hidden in plain sight, waiting to be approached with care rather than certainty. The conversation continues, not because we lack knowledge, but because the past is richer than any single explanation can hold.